This week on Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. For people with disabilities, to be truly seen beyond a wheelchair or a hearing aid is a fundamental truth.
When you don't see yourself in certain areas, in certain places, you don't think you exist there.
About 1 in 5 Americans have a disability, constituting the largest minority group in the United States. Within the group, there's a huge diversity of visible and hidden disabilities.
It's great when we see ourselves. We, as people with disabilities, don't see that very often.
I really feel like there needs to be representation of more people with disabilities leading the movement.
Today, 3 people who've made it their life's mission to humanize living with a disability and advocating for positive change.
Welcome to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Heffel. Each week, in a partnership between Denver7 and CPR, we have a real talk about issues impacting underrepresented people across Colorado and amplify voices you may not always hear on TV or radio.
TV viewers will notice we are in a different space this week.
We're bringing this episode to you from inside CPR's radio studio in downtown Denver.
Denver7 recently moved to a brand new building in the Five Points neighborhood, and we're still working on settling into that space, but we are excited to show it to you very soon.
Now, until that time comes, we'll be here at CPR's downtown newsroom, continuing our mission of amplifying voices you may not always hear from. And today, we're having a real talk on disabilities.
The CDC says more than 70 million people in the U.S. are living with disabilities today. Despite how common it is, they are still often overlooked when it comes to conversations surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And for people with disabilities who are part of more than one marginalized group, the impacts can be even deeper.
According to the National Disability Institute, approximately 12.2% of Black Coloradans identify as disabled. That's about 28,650 people in our state.
And because of their intersectional identity as both Black and disabled, they're more likely to be faced with not only one, but 2 systems of oppression: racism and ableism.
Wow. Well, Stuart Tucker Lundy knows that all too well. He's a filmmaker, storyteller, and advocate, and is on the board of directors of Rocky Mountain Human Services. Stuart, thanks so much for being with us today. Stuart, you've spent your whole life pushing boundaries and challenging people's perceptions of being Black and disabled. Where did this drive to achieve come from?
My mama, my mother. My mother is an essential part of my life, always has been, and also my grandmother. My grandmother was named Frances Stewart Tucker, and she was one of the first Black principals in Dade County, Miami. And subsequently, she had a school named after her, and that's where my name comes from, Stuart Tucker Lundy. So, yes, they were very instrumental in pushing forward because, you can't get anything done in one place.
So you had a diving accident when you were just 14 years old. Can you describe what happened?
Yes, I was 14 years old. I had been down to Shreveport, Louisiana, visiting my brother. Was been there for about 3 or 4 days, and it was boring. I really didn't take in Shreveport, Louisiana, or anything like that. And he was working at the time at in the military base. So his friends came by and they picked me up and they asked him could take me to a lake, which I'd never been to before, but I'd been swimming and diving and done it competitively, things like that. Long story short, hot Louisiana sand makes you make bad decisions. And I did. And I jumped in about probably as about much water as in one of these containers on your table, and fractured C4, C5 of my vertebrae, and it left me a quadriplegic at the time, incomplete quadriplegic. So, yeah, that was 41 years ago. I celebrated that on July 2nd, just past year. And it was a celebration.
It was a celebration.
Yes.
I assume part of that celebration is just the perseverance. When I think about 14,
Yes.
That is such a pivotal age for a young man. How did you navigate that journey after your accident to the point where you are celebrating the anniversary of when it happened?
I feel like Stu, which is most people who know me or when I was growing up, they called me Stu and Stu Baby, Stewie Wonder, things like that. But I feel like Stu jumped in the lake and Stuart Tucker Lundy came out of that lake. And for me, it's been about just head down, moving forward. I can't get anything done if I'm constantly thinking, looking back, and woe is me, woe is me. I mean, and don't get me wrong, that is a thing. You have to marinate in where you are to go forward. So, but for me, it's about forward action. I need to go forward.
Yeah. And why do you think Black disabled folks struggle for visibility and support within our society as well as within, your own culture?
You know, I'll start with our own culture first. I think it stems from when I used to be a kid, and you have that uncle that was special uncle. That special uncle was always in the back, and you kind of just shoved him in the back. You really didn't get a lot of attention, things like that. We just call him that special uncle. He's a little bit off or what have you. And other cultures may have it, but I'm speaking on the one you asked me. And it's a little bit of that out of sight, out of mind. That's been the case, I think, for quite a while, and I think it's just fostered itself. I think economically also that you quoted some numbers there. Economically also, we didn't have the means, some Black families, to take care of someone that has a disability, because this is a very expensive accident. I mean, these chairs are $70,000. These vans, you have the price of the van, but then you have the price of the alteration of the van. You have to alter your house. You have to alter your bedroom, all things like that. So it can get quite expensive, very expensive, yes.
If you could change or advocate for one thing in support of Black people with disabilities, what would that be? You mentioned, cost being a factor. Maybe that is something that you're concerned with, but what would the one thing be, the most important?
More visibility. I produced a commercial. JanSport reached out to our production company that I'm part of, Listen Production, and asked us if we could make a commercial around a bag that was accessible. I wanted some people of color, and I wanted that there. And a couple of times I had to roll away from the set because I didn't see myself there. I never saw myself in that position when I was that age. I'm 56 now. I had to think about that one. I'm 56 now, and but at age 20, 19, what have you, in that area, I did not see myself. I saw myself one time when I was growing up, and I'd never wanted that to happen again. And when you don't see yourself in certain areas, in certain places, you don't think you exist there. So I want to be that person that maybe looks at this, or for that matter, somebody who unfortunately had an accident today, is looking at this and says, hey, that guy looks pretty cool. Well, at least I'm trying to be.
You are cool, and I know that you are changing that for future generations so that they do see someone that looks like them. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate both of you. Thank you so much.
Stuart Tucker Lundy's work highlights how much is hidden within this community, but it's not only African Americans who want to be visible.
Yeah, what happens when you're crazy about sports, but the world wants to confine you to a wheelchair? Up next, we'll hear from a competitive athlete who champions the adaptive sports movement. Stay with us. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Heffel.
And I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
Adaptive sports programs are proven to make a huge difference for people with physical or intellectual disabilities.
A study published in the journal Health and Quality of Life Outcomes in 2017 assessed the effects. People in the study said playing sports helped them discover abilities they didn't know they had. Some found a sense of belonging and fairness they didn't see elsewhere in their lives, and they got involved more deeply in their communities. Overall, their quality of life improved with sports.
And Donna Callahan knows this firsthand. She's a professional athlete and consultant in Denver. She spent her life competing and now helps get other people into sports. Donna, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's awesome. Wonderful to be here.
And Donna, you have transverse myelitis, a neurological disorder that causes inflammation of the spinal cord and has caused complete or incomplete paralysis. As a kid, how did you begin to challenge people's perceptions of what you could accomplish?
Yeah, so I got sick with transverse myelitis in 1972 when I was 3 years old. So imagine what disability looked like in 1972. And even my wheelchair that I was sent home with from the hospital was very heavy, very archaic. So even just getting around was challenging. I was the youngest student in my school district back home in Silicon Valley that was mainstreamed into my school district. And so I was 5 years old, and I wanted to walk to school with my brother and my neighborhood friends just like anybody else and not have to take the bus 3 blocks. So when you talk about first advocating, that was very young. My parents went to city council to ask about getting ramps built and within a couple blocks of our house so that I could walk to school. Town council wasn't sure if $250 was too much for one student in the school district. And we call that in the disability community the curb cut effect. So when you create ramps and curb cuts, it opens up a whole new world for skateboarders, for people in wheelchairs, for families with strollers. So that was back in the early 70s when we talk about first advocating for the disability community. I probably didn't know what it was at the time, but my parents led by example and showed me what that was all about.
Have they talked to you about that feeling of being one day they're not advocates and the next day they have to be advocates for you, their child?
Yeah, they figured it out. And, there weren't Facebook groups. There wasn't an Instagram community back then. It was typewriters and letters to news stations, just like you guys, trying to figure this out and navigate the disability community. At the time, there were men and women coming home from Vietnam with disabilities, but I didn't fit into that category. I'm 3 years old.
Right.
So it was a whole new avenue, a whole new way to navigate the world in that you didn't see a lot of kids like myself back in the 70s going to school, taking part in regular PE with all my other classmates.
Well, speaking of taking part in regular PE, that got you pretty far in life because you are a professional athlete. Tell us about your experience becoming a professional athlete.
I don't know if I'd call it a professional athlete. I was a competitive athlete.
I think that's pretty professional in my opinion. My skills are...
I think, again, it started with my parents and my upbringing. My dad was a high school coach and athletic director and always made sure that my family always made sure that I was involved and active in whatever activities my family was doing. My dad's cycling club built me my first hand cycle when I was 10 years old. It was a 3-wheel bike with a crank up, close to my arms. But it kind of started things on their way in that I wasn't treated any differently when playing hide and seek or scooting along on a skateboard in the neighborhood. And so I knew that sport was always a big part of my life. I started skiing in Tahoe, and I found my people, I found my community. I just kind of started hanging out with a lot of really cool athletes in the disability community and had a coach here in Longmont locally, Jacob Highville, shout out to Jacob, who was a wheelchair racer in the Paralympics. And I have, I guess, the body makeup of a wheelchair racer with long arms and a good, strong upper body. So that's kind of what I started with, is competing at an elite level in wheelchair racing.
So after years of that competition, you shifted away and you worked with the Paralympic military support groups and with the Paralympic Friends and Family Program. What made you want to shift away from actually competing in sports?
Yeah, well, what kind of started me also in sport is I worked for all 4 national adapted sport, multi-disability organizations across the country. And so I had worked with a group and decided to go out on my own. I had continued to report to leadership that did not have a disability, yet they were leading the movement. And I really feel like there needs to be representation of more people with disabilities leading the movement that have that lived experience, that know how challenging it is, one, to find access to equipment, to find access to mentors, to find access to competitions and training and being able to compete at a high level. And so I kind of actually started out as a professional before I became an athlete. And I do enjoy being behind the scenes and supporting the team behind the team and advocating, yet again, many decades later, for the adapted sport movement.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that advocacy and helping create that access you just mentioned. What are you up to today when it comes to disabilities in sports tourism and advocating to make sure there's access?
So as part of my business, All in Sport Consulting, it's kind of the intersection of the disability sport movement and broader disability sport conversations. I created a few years ago the Adapted Sport Economic Impact Report, so that we can move away from the charity narrative around adapted sport. As we know, sports, as the games are happening right now, the Olympics and Paralympics, they're a big business. And so anytime we have a wheelchair basketball tournament or a wheelchair tennis tournament going into a community, we need to consider what is that economic impact. Those athletes come to town with their families. They get hotel rooms. They go to restaurants. They see the attractions. And so that was one of the motivators for creating the Adapted Sport Economic Impact Report, was to create that business case and that business narrative around adapted sport and move away from charity.
And Mike, it seems to me that it using data to humanize
Thank
this.
you.
And
Yes.
that just seems to be like there is a humanization happening here because of the data you're providing.
Yeah, and it's athletes.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if they're athletes with disabilities.
Athletes,
They're
period.
athletes, period.
And that report is also bringing some accountability. So I think that's strong.
Yes.
Donna Callahan, thank you so much for joining
Thank you.
us.
It was wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, still to come, the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act passed nearly 35 years ago. Despite that law and years of advocacy, people with disabilities still struggle to just get around our public spaces. Coming up, meet a Denver City Councilman who's working to solve those challenges and provide more opportunity to everyone.
This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Heffel. Many Coloradans with physical disabilities continue to struggle with mobility in their daily lives.
And that's despite the Americans with Disabilities Act being passed in 1990 to establish equal rights. More than 3 decades later, barriers are still widespread.
Yeah. Cities are often designed without proper consideration for accessibility, creating challenges for people with disabilities to navigate neighborhoods, access some buildings, get public transportation, or even just use the sidewalk. In Denver specifically, the city says about 40% of the sidewalk network either doesn't exist or is just not ADA compliant.
Denver City Councilman Chris Hines, who uses a wheelchair himself, has fought for equitable access at the local, state, and federal levels. A new state law named after him was signed in 2018, and the Chris Hines Act closed loopholes to prevent the fraudulent use of disability parking.
And Councilman Hines joins us now to talk more about some solutions to equitable access. Councilman, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So let's go back to that 2018 law. What did the law achieve, and what are you most proud of contributing to it?
So the law in 2018 was about making sure that everyone had access to parking for people with disabilities. And so we did some research all over the nation, and it turns out that nationally, the number one reason people fraudulently obtain and use disability parking placards is for free parking. And so most people are familiar with the red and blue parking placards. Those are mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Many states around the nation, I think at the time when we researched, there were 26 states around the nation that just said statewide, if you had a red or blue parking placard, then you could park for free at a parking meter. Seems really simple, right? But it turns out that not every state had that regulation, and not every city followed the state's regulation. And so it actually started on the Auraria campus. I parked in a parking space that was designed for people with disabilities. There was a parking meter there. I parked, did not pay the meter, went to my meeting. When I came back, I got a ticket. So I immediately appealed. And I said, Denver Revised Municipal Code, the Denver Law 54485, says that anyone with a valid placard can park for free at a parking meter. The Auraria campus said, we're a state entity. We don't have to follow Denver's laws. So then I said, guess what? Colorado Revised Statute, CRS 424-1208, says I can also park for free at a meter with a disability parking placard, a valid placard. And they said, actually, we're not a state entity either. We're a state enterprise. We don't have to follow the state law either. And I said, I don't think that's right. This is an acquired disability. And as an able-bodied person, you know clearly the rights and responsibilities around a parking space and whether you should pay the meter. If you don't have to pay after 6 p.m. as an example, or on Sundays or weekends, it clearly says that on the sign. But for people with disabilities, it's not clear at all.
You mentioned this is an acquired disability. You haven't always used a wheelchair. Would you mind sharing your personal story with us?
Yeah, so I came to Colorado in January of 2007 for a tech startup. And as startups do, it did not start up. But I stayed for the rugged outdoor lifestyle. And so I was a runner and a soccer player. In August 26, 2008, that was the Tuesday night of the Democratic National Convention, I was in a crash. I was on a bike. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but likely I was hit by a car going the wrong way up 18th, so just a block from here, 18th and Logan. So I don't remember the crash. Whoever it was left, and so I was rushed to Denver Health. I woke up and I can't move most of my body. So I'm paralyzed basically from the chest down. So T3 for medical professionals. And so I'm, more than 15 years in a wheelchair at this point.
Beyond mobility, the ADA was supposed to remove barriers to find work, yet just hearing what you had to do with the parking situation, you went, so long, this, the barriers kept popping up. That's just for parking. Talk about the barriers for finding work as someone with a disability.
Well, so here's one example that just happened in the last month. There's a credit union that's one block from where I live. They went through a major renovation. Before the renovation, everyone went in the same entrance. After the renovation, able-bodied people go upstairs, and I go in a different entrance as a ramp around the side. And so sometimes employment, there might be some simple things as basic access to the building or basic access to restrooms. There's actually no accessible restroom on this floor. So I had to go to a different floor to use the restroom before this interview. And even just the physical barriers of getting access to employment, that's not even talking about some of the things that we know about that are in place, like Schedule A at the federal level, which is a way for people with disabilities to theoretically get easier access to federal jobs. I tried to use Schedule A about 10 years ago, and I didn't even get a response from the agency, the federal agency where I applied. And so sometimes we have physical barriers, sometimes we have restroom barriers or logistical barriers, sometimes we have things that look like lip service or that look nice, but that are lip service.
Yeah.
We only have about a minute left, but I have to ask you this because we talk a lot about the importance of representation on this show. As one of few elected officials with a visible disability, what does that feel like in terms of advocating for this community?
It's, I mean, we are all ambassadors of our own kind, whether we like it or not. It's great when we see ourselves in positions of leadership, in areas of role models. We, as people with disabilities, don't see that very often. And so I feel blessed and honored that the people of District 10 took a chance, broke that barrier, and allowed me to be the first elected official in Denver's history, local, state, or federal, who uses a wheelchair to get around.
Denver City Councilman Chris Hines, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And that's this week's episode of Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Every week, we will have a Real Talk on issues that impact Coloradans who are often overlooked.
And you can find all of our shows on denver7.com/realtalk or at cpr.org/realtalk. Have a great day.